My name's Moira McIver. I'm an artist. I was born in Scotland and grew up in Scotland. My mother is from Weedore in Donegal. My father's from Maryhill in Glasgow. And my mother would have come across to Glasgow as a young woman when she was about 16, with only mainly Gaelic, speaking Gaelic, and she worked in Glasgow in a number of different jobs. And she met my father in Glasgow, and that's where we sort of grew up in Scotland. And now, but half of us live really across in Donegal, and half of us are in Scotland, so we're always back and forward. And that's a lot of the interest that I've had in my work as an artist from back in the 1990s. I've worked a lot about interest in the cycles of people passing between or going between Donegal and Glasgow and Scotland. So I undertook a residency in October 2021 with Street Level Photoworks Gallery in Glasgow, and it was an exchange residence with ArtLink Art Gallery in Donegal. And as a part of it, I was interested in researching into Irish people and where they'd settled in areas of Glasgow. And I spoke to a number of people about their memories and history. And so it was particularly around the Gorbals and Govanhill. And one of the things which came out, and I've got looking at photographs, and this is my collection, actually my cousin Catherine Callahan's collection of photographs that would have been taken in the 1940s and maybe early 50s by her father John Callahan and her mother Mary Callahan, and they're box brownie images, and they're taken in Queen's Park, and they show young people sitting in groups in the park, obviously socializing and getting together. And when I spoke to a few different people, they said that this area in the park, in Queen's Park in Govanhill, is known as Donegal Hill because lots of Irish people would have got together and met up in the park. And as you can see in the photographs, they're often very well dressed in their suits and lovely outfits. And another person had mentioned that it was possibly because it was maybe at the weekend when people wouldn't have been working, and possibly on a Sunday afternoon, so people would have been dressed their Sunday best. So I'm trying to make a piece of work myself which reflects the number of people and sort of their presence back in time on Donegal Hill in Queen's Park. I wanted to speak a bit about the old chapel, which is St Mary's in Derrybeg, County Donegal, which has had a long connection for me in terms of I would have been in the old chapel as a child, and my mother told me lots of stories around it. So I'm just going to speak about a sort of an encounter with the chapel itself, and also the James Glass album, which was an album from a historical album of images that were taken around Derrybeg Chapel. Okay, so it is a fine spring afternoon when I visit the old chapel in Derrybeg, which has sat disused and empty for at least 10 years. Through the high arched windows which reflect above me, I see glimpses of 1980s pine woodwork, creating a network of balconies and stairways, evidence that the church was fitted for other community purposes when it was replaced by a new St Mary's chapel built on higher ground. During the 1990s, the old chapel became a youth club and a community library. As I make my way around the side of the church, it feels intensely claustrophobic, wedged between high rocks on one side and the bank of the river on the other. I am struck by the strange location of this imposing building. The steps at the back of the chapel lead upwards to the new church building. I take out my phone to compare this spot with an image of an original photograph taken by James Glass in 1889. This photograph formed part of the defence in the trial of Father James McFadden and local people accused of the murder of District Inspector William Martin on Sunday, the 3rd of February, 1889. A warrant had previously been issued for Father McFadden's arrest, and he was to be charged with conspiracy to induce local people not to pay increasing rent demands. Father McFadden had proved himself to be an indomitable force of support for the local people, helping to defend those threatened with eviction. On the day of the murder, a large body of the Royal Irish Constabulary were deployed outside the church waiting for Father McFadden to leave after Sunday Mass. Some of the mass-goers were still present when Inspector Martin attempted to arrest the priest. As he left the church, the inspector followed him up the steps leading to the parochial house. There are different versions, but some suggest that during the arrest, the inspector had aggressively drawn his sword and held it over the priest. A woman shouted that the priest was in danger, and as the crowd surged forward, stones were thrown, and Inspector Martin was hit with a blunt instrument, receiving fatal wounds from which he died within a few hours. The priest and 10 local people were tried for murder in Portlaoise in October 1889. Father McFadden was released after 2 weeks of the trial, admitting guilt in obstruction of the place, while other defendants received prison sentences ranging from 6 months to 10 years. The Derry photographer, James Glass, was asked to take a series of photographs for the trial to support the case for the defence. This photograph shows 4 figures standing near the top of the steps, 3 men and a woman. They stand stiffly, as if positioned like coordinates on a map. Too early for crime scene drawings, their positions seem to indicate where the struggle took place. Their awkward stillness seems oddly incongruent, but is typical of photography from this era, where subjects stood still for several minutes at a time in order for their image to be captured on the camera's glass plate. An earlier set of photographs by James Glass, taken in the 1870s, show families huddled outside turf dwellings around the Gweedore area, called out into the blinding light to stand passively for the camera gaze. These images were used in the trial to show the squalid living conditions of tenant farmers. It was argued that these people were driven to act as the inspector physically threatened their priest. Who can blame their overflow of anger at the thought of the policeman robbing them of their source of strength and solace? Father McFadden had encouraged them to voice their rights, to be treated as human beings rather than cattle to be herded from their land at the whim of the landlord. The James Glass images were made using an early photographic technique called wet plate collodion, a liquid process which involves the pouring of light-sensitive chemicals over the surface of thin glass plates. It can be unpredictable and often results in accidental blemishes on the print surface. In these images, the scuffs, scratches, and light pools seem to heighten the harshness of the landscape and the fragility of these people's existence. As I walk back down towards the front of the building, my hand touches the rough stone edge of a carved stone font set into the chapel wall, and I think about how many hands have dipped into this cup of water and lingered as they left the building. Attending the church in the 1880s must have been an uplifting experience for those whose own homes were dark, acrid, smoke-filled turf shacks. Did they feel their spirits soar in the vaulted space, rising together in prayer and song, or were they just glad to come in from the cold? My mother recounted a story about Father McFadden and a flood in St Mary's in 1880. In a freak summer storm, the pressure of the rising river burst through the floor of the church during a service, and in the torrent of water which filled the building, the doors became blocked and 5 people were drowned, including a young altar boy. The priest only escaped by standing on the high altarpiece to reach a window. In 2009, the church succumbed again to the forces of nature, and local news footage show it submerged in water. I imagine the book pages drifting like leaves in the flooded interior, and I reflect on the weight of emotion still contained within these walls.